Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Higgins, producer of the CX Leader podcast, and welcome back to our summer Encore Series, where we're highlighting some of our favorite of over 270 episodes of the CX Leader podcast. This week, we wanted to replay episode 162, originally dropped on April 20th, 2021. This episode featured two Qualtrics experts, Chelsea Bright and Sydney Heimbrock, as they discussed how customer experience is applied in government. We really liked this episode because our guests highlighted how well some local, state, and federal government have embraced CX principles as a way to connect to communities and commercial businesses. Just a note that since this interview is over 2 years old, some details or situations might not be the same, but we think the takeaways from our guests are still solid. So here's our encore presentation of CX for the People. Enjoy.
Can you think of a non-commercial body of people that could teach companies a thing or two about CX?
In many ways, if you think about what democracy is and how it was conceptualized, that is really CX, which is how do you take feedback from a group of people and use that to help inform decision making?
What government customer experience can teach those of us in the commercial space? On this episode of the CX Leader Podcast.
The CX Leader podcast with Steve Walker is produced by Walker, an experience management firm that helps our clients accelerate their XM success. You can find out more at walkerinfo.com.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Walker, and thanks for listening to this episode of the CX Leader podcast. On our podcast, we explore topics and themes to help leaders like you leverage all the benefits of your customer experience and help your customers and prospects want to do more business with you. Here in the United States, we don't often think of ourselves as customers of the government, constituents, community members, voters, but not really customers. However, governing bodies from the local, state, and federal levels have been embracing customer experience as a way to connect to the community. And we, in the commercial realm, can learn a thing or two from these efforts. My guests on this episode are going to help us better understand government and CX. Chelsea Bright is the Global Head of Government, and Sydney Heimbrock is the Chief Industry Advisor for Government, both of whom are with Qualtrics, a world leader in experience management software. And full disclosure, a great partner here of ours here at Walker, and one that I've had the pleasure of having several of their executives on the podcast in the past. So Chelsea, Sydney, thanks for being guests on the CX Leader podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, Chelsea, why don't I start with you? One of the things we like to do on the podcast is just give our listeners a little context. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of background on yourself and maybe a little bit of an overview of the government practice there at Qualtrics. But how did you get into the world of CX and then actually end up in a role where you're bringing CX to the government?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's a great question. A very roundabout way for me. I actually started out my career in academics as a professor, teaching masters of public policy students how to leverage data science and statistics and research to help inform policy and decision-making in the government space, and utilize Qualtrics in that capacity to help collect a lot of that data, and actually used the Qualtrics platform in my own personal research on that front as well around voting and citizen engagement within government. And after a while, realized that I wanted to be a little bit more hands-on with the work rather than just studying it from afar. So I took a position managing the data and research team for the state of California. And in that capacity, began working with Qualtrics to start collecting feedback from many of our customers at the state level. And ended up coming over 3 years ago to Qualtrics and have been working with our customers across the globe to help design better feedback and customer experience programs, and really to take a lot of the best practices that have been developed in the enterprise and corporate world and apply those to government. And as we've gone through this process, I think we've discovered some areas of innovation that are actually happening within government that we can now share back with the corporate space as well, which has been really exciting.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into that because I'm fascinated with this topic as we were talking off air. Sydney, I know you're a little newer to Qualtrics, but what's your journey in the CX world been like?
Yeah, so I'm actually really excited to have joined Qualtrics several months ago after a 25-year career in federal service, including 15 years doing international development and another 13 or so as a federal executive, where I helped establish the innovation lab at OPM, which is where I discovered customer experience through human-centered design, which is a really transformational set of methods and a mindset around focusing on the human beings that we serve in government and bringing that focus to everything we do. And so customer experience really falls naturally out of that. And what I love about being at Qualtrics is that we are enabling a digital platform through which government organizations can institutionalize design and design thinking in everything that they do. So it's just really cool to be part of continuing to spread that magic across the public sector.
And OPM, just for non-government folks, is the Office of
Personnel Management. Yep,
Office.
It's the human capital leader of the federal government.
So you're really more of an industry vet, sort of in the vertical space of the federal government. And Chelsea, you'd be a little more like me. You came up, although much better credentialed, but you came up more from the social science, quantitative research background. And here you are collaborating with bringing some of these best practices to government. First of all, I'll go back to you, Chelsea, again. But how do you guys define CX in the government space? Because it's not exactly how we would define it in a for-profit situation. So, and maybe if you could even break it down kind of federal, state, local.
Yeah, no, we will, because it does look a little bit different. It's been really an interesting journey of these last several years on what does CX mean in government. And in many ways, if you think about what democracy is and how it was conceptualized, that is really CX, which is how do you take feedback from a group of people and use that to help inform decision making. The challenge with many of the traditional ways of collecting feedback that governments have used is that so often we end up hearing from a very small select portion of the population that are able to provide feedback. So if you think about local government and the town hall as it was originally conceptualized, where people can come on 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon to provide feedback on bike lanes, right? There's just not that many people that are going to be able to participate in that. And so as we think about broadening CX and leveraging things that have been introduced into the corporate world, we're able to put a different spin on that and say, we can leverage technology now for the first time in history to really try to hear from everyone and to make that feedback more representative. And where, the departure, I would say, from traditional CX as it's defined in the corporate world is that a lot of the ways and metrics and outcomes we're trying to achieve are very different in the government space. So we're not trying to optimize profits. We're really looking at some of these big social outcomes like engagement, trust in government, increasing, public safety and educational outcomes, and a whole host of other mission critical elements that governments are focused on. And so we're looking at how do you leverage feedback to help inform that process and help government agencies deliver on that mission more effectively. And, in the local space, we've been fortunate to partner with some really fantastic organizations and customers. Like, City of Orlando has been one of our older customers that have done some really phenomenal work on this, where we spent a lot of time trying to re-envision what NPS should look like in the government space, because this idea of a net promoter score where your likelihood of recommending a service just doesn't really translate in the government space when you only have one provider to use for your trash and recycling services. And so we ended up coming up with this measure of trust in government to capture the relationship that those residents had with the city, and have used that to demonstrate that traditional measures of customer satisfaction are really tightly linked with trust in government. So if you can improve customer satisfaction, you can also improve trust in government. So it's been a really kind of fascinating journey on that front. And, Sydney, I know that you've been working on this in the federal space, and that looks kind of different in the federal space, given the focus there as well.
Yeah, I think it looks different, but it also has significant similarities. I mean, the underlying truth is that you cannot achieve the policy outcomes without public adoption. And public adoption relies, especially as we move more and more toward digital delivery of programs and services, you have to understand people's behaviors, people's desires, how to reach people. You have to understand people in order to really drive the adoption required to achieve the mission. And so, that's really where we come in, is equipping agencies, organizations with the analysis, the data and analysis that they need to understand the people they serve and to meet them where they are.
That's a great overview. You know, I especially like the discussion about how the outcomes aren't the same as in the private sector. You know, in the private sector, we tend to use the feedback to try to predict the kind of behavior we want. So that still works. It's just, what do you define as being that behavior you want? And it would be outcomes, so forth. Actually, just listening to you, I wonder if, you know, maybe this is the bottom line for government service, that, you know, it really is in terms of how they engage the public or how they are driving the outcomes. And I don't know if that resonates, but I love the comment, you know, democracy was built around feedback. And then you see some of the new business models which really rely on, you know, say Uber, where it's the passenger rating the driver and the driver rating the passenger. There's sort of an accountability there. So I don't know if that sparks any other thoughts in your mind about that space, but I'm really intrigued with that. And then maybe how that might relate back to the for-profit space.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that we talk a lot about in the public sector is this idea of the Amazon effect, which is that, you know, companies like Amazon have totally come in and transformed the way we engage with organizations and a lot of the expectations that people bring. And that's true of government too, where people have much higher expectations of what government should be able to do in the 21st century relative to often their experience with it. And you know, if you look at overall trust in government, that's been declining throughout the years. And I think that's, you know, in part related to the fact that it's just been really hard for these institutions that are hundreds of years old to kind of keep up with this rapid pace of digital transformation that we've seen. But that gap between trust in government and government's ability to execute on its mission is really problematic, because to Sydney's point, if you don't have people involved in that process, you aren't engaging those stakeholders, it's nearly impossible to achieve these big societal outcomes. So we've got to figure out, how do we start bridging that gap, building trust? You know, this, you brought up Uber, Steve, right? That system works because we trust the system and we trust the people that are involved in the system. And so we've got to figure out ways to begin inserting that into government and enabling governments to get feedback from their stakeholders and start responding to that, so we begin to rebuild.
Sydney, I'll go to you now, but what's encouraging to me, and maybe this is just driven by the popular media and stuff, that we're sort of taught to kind of be cynical about government in general, but there are some really exciting things that are going on from a CX perspective in the government. I know in my state, like in Indiana, they're doing a super job on this vaccination. I mean, they've got a website and you sign up for your appointment and you show up and they know you're coming. And it's really been quite refreshing to see how well they've done that, for example. But maybe you could give us some other examples of where the government really is leading the way or paving the way from a CX perspective.
Yeah, I actually think that's a great example. We've actually been involved with a lot of states and counties to help create exactly that kind of really seamless experience for people who are already, you know, very rattled by everything that has happened through the course of the pandemic. And so making it easier, as easy as possible, for people to figure out where to go, get registered, schedule their appointments, you know, follow through with any adverse impact, all of that needs to be as easy as possible, because again, the mission is to get people vaccinated, and you can't do that if people are not engaging with these websites or other places where they can go to get help. And so we've actually worked on our own solution, which is being used, for example, in Missouri, in a county of Michigan, all over the country. And we're finding that in places where those kinds of solutions are being implemented, the cost, the speed, the citizen and resident satisfaction, I mean, it's all just exponentially better, which again, you know, as Chelsea keeps emphasizing, that's just critical to increase the level of trust in the programs and everything the programs represent. So that's just a really great example of where we have really transformed how people understand what their government is and what government's role is to serve them and to solve these really complex, big, hairy problems.
Chelsea, any thoughts from your standpoint in terms of where government has been leading the way in some of the CX work that you've seen in your career?
So, there's, I think, a couple of areas that really stand out. And part of this is because of, regulations that governments have in place. But the area of accessibility, for example, is an area that, and rightfully so, governments have to, have a number of requirements that they follow. So if you think about WCAG, the World Organization in terms of website accessibility, right? That is driven by government regulation. But if we think about how we interface then from a digital platform and make these tools of providing feedback accessible, those government requirements have actually pushed our entire platform and team, whether it's corporate or government, to be more accessible and to think about things. How do someone that has that is sight impaired, for example, how would they be able to provide feedback on a system? Do we have ways for them to leverage, audio solutions? Do we have, the ability to have readers be able to scan those intake forms? Have you thought about, individuals that, might be impaired from a color perspective, right? Someone who's colorblind, right? And we're thinking about that when we're rolling these out. So there's like a whole host of things that we've had to take into consideration from an accessibility perspective on the government side. And those innovations have translated over into the corporate world as well. And we're seeing, a lot of the results of that. And so as we kind of work with our government customers to think about how we create really inclusive feedback mechanisms and, and look across the board at who we're hearing from, that's certainly an innovation that we have passed on and has been utilized by many of the corporate customers that Qualtrics work with today. And I know that, Sydney, you've got some examples too on the transparency side is another area where oftentimes governments are mandated to be transparent about sharing their results. And there's a whole host of innovations that we've produced, including one of our product launches this year around public-facing dashboards that came out of the government space, but is now a feature that's available to a lot of our corporate customers as well.
I want to take a moment to tell you about Walker's new report, Next Level CX for B2B companies, which focuses on helping B2B companies rise to the next level of their CX excellence. Walker collaborated with the Qualtrics XM Institute and discovered some insightful conclusions about CX maturity and how B2B is performing compared to B2C. Download the report for free today at cxleaderpodcast.com/nextlevelcx. All right, my guests on the podcast this week are Chelsea Bright, who's the Global Head of Government, and Sydney Heimbrock, who is the Chief Industry Advisor for the government practice at Qualtrics. We're having a fascinating discussion about how CX has been applied to government and some of the exciting things that come out of that. One of the things that we've talked about is accessibility. The government has to provide services to everybody, and historically has always been a leader in providing accessibility. But Chelsea, you were talking off air a little bit of, kind of how you can leverage technology to enhance accessibility. Maybe if you could just explore that a little bit, because I find that's fascinating.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. It really has been. And I think this idea of inclusivity and being accessible has pushed us to think about how technology can help to bridge some of those gaps that would have historically been pretty hard to overcome. And language accessibility is one of those where, working with government agencies that do require access through language, and then how do we incorporate that into the product? And so one of the things that we've done on that front is to be able to leverage embedded data that it's in people's browsers, where you can use that metadata to determine the language that they're already have their system set up for, and then surface the feedback mechanisms or surveys or forms directly in their native language, rather than having to ask them to tell you what that is and kind of go to select that from a menu of options, right? Just for one, makes them feel like you've actually done the effort to consider that, and also increases the number of people that are going to be responding to that feedback. And that's, an area that whether you're a government or a private business could absolutely utilize to increase the number of people that are responding, to make them feel that their opinions are valued, and also the validity of the data, because you're asking that in their native language that they're going to feel the most comfortable in.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up accessibility and transparency, because again, I think transparency is one of the big macro factors that is really driving a lot of the economy today, particularly in a world where access to information is so relatively easy. You really can't hide the peanut anymore. because the ability for people to access information. So Sydney, why don't you talk a little bit about transparency? This is a topic that we've had on the podcast before. It's just really, I think, key to having a great experience management platform is a fundamental concept of transparency.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the dashboards that we enable can be publicly facing and can definitely demonstrate the return on investment of public money is essentially what it's about, right? Taxpayers, here's what's actually here's what we're doing with your money. Here are the results that we're achieving for you. And that way people can kind of see that virtuous cycle, right, between what we're all about to do as of now, May 15th, paying our taxes every year and seeing the investments that delivers for us. I think the other really interesting thing that's a little different about government and that I've seen personally just really change, really transform over the past decade with the introduction of design thinking and design-oriented tools like Qualtrics and sentiment analysis is that governments are getting better and better, not just at the back end transparency after they've delivered a service or a policy or program, but on the front end, how they engage with people to understand what people actually need in the first place. And as they think about a certain, policy question, what assumptions do they have? What are sort of some of the unexpected behavioral trends that people report that government can really incorporate into their approach to designing a solution that's actually going to work? And that kind of discovery research, that kind of real community engagement in the decision-making phase is critical for the kind of what I think of as productive or proactive transparency, where government is really living its democratic ideal of full engagement from beginning to end of the policy cycle.
Yeah, just to build on that, Sydney, one of the examples that I've really loved is we did some work with Census throughout the pandemic on the household pulse survey, which was a survey that went out via text message to tens of thousands of Americans, just asking them how they're dealing with the pandemic, things from, the impact that it's had on their job, to access to food, health impacts. And then the census then, after collecting that data and feedback on people's experience with the pandemic, publishes that in public facing dashboards. Not only so that, any of us as citizens can kind of go and see collectively what that experience has been like for a representative group of Americans, but also so that other government agencies can use that. And I think that's a great tool that the public or the private sector could actually utilize more. If you think about a lot of the social mission and work that many companies are doing to be able to engage with their customer base and kind of share the results of the feedback they're getting and how they're using that feedback to drive key decisions that the company is making, can be a really powerful tool to building your brand and building your trust with customers, because they've seen that, okay, that feedback didn't just go into a black box. Actually, I was one of thousands of people that had that same idea, and you're responding to that. And that also then kind of reinforces that feedback loop where people are more likely to provide feedback, down the road and continue to engage with you because they've seen that you've really taken that seriously and are utilizing that to make important decisions.
Yeah, we talk a lot about closing the loop and kind of the virtuous feedback cycle of using the feedback, acting on it, showing progress, and then going back and making sure that that's getting messaged. I wonder if either of you could give us an example of maybe in government where they have been able to increase the trust in government, or they have actually been able to move through a policy recommendation that actually did result in good outcomes for the governed.
I mean, yeah, there's lots of examples. So I think Chelsea already mentioned the very rapid pivoting that the city of Orlando was able to accomplish when they had to take all of their services online in response to COVID. And they were able to do that really, really quickly. And at the same time, use our data collection and analytics capabilities to improve the experiences people had through digitization so that they actually have had a measurable increase in their trust metric across all of their different service delivery areas.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. We've got another example that comes to mind is some of the work we're doing down in Queensland with their tax and revenue collection. So Sydney mentioned taxes season is coming up for all of us, where they actually used CX as a way of communicating back and forth with residents and getting feedback on the process as people were providing providing that. And they really used this concept of nudges, where rather than kind of wait until that last date when things were due, they would proactively reach out to individuals to make sure that they had the information that they needed, to see if they needed additional assistance, to kind of remind them, hey, you're likely having this amount due that's coming up. Would you like to get into a payment plan? Would you like to, pay that now? Are you going to need any assistance? And just by engaging with citizens and getting their feedback on this, not only did they reduce a lot of internal work that would happen after the fact normally, but they also increased the amount of taxes that they're collecting and people's ability to pay by being able to work with them and put them on the appropriate programs. Really cool kind of example of that, feedback loop happening throughout the process, not just at the end. I think so often with CX, we think about it as something that we do kind of after the transaction happens. And there's a lot of really creative ways to, throughout the transaction, especially if it's a longer process, to start getting feedback and use that as a way to begin dialogue with our customers.
Well, Chelsea, Sydney, we've reached that part of the show where I ask every guest to give our listeners a tip. We call it take-home value. It's your best tip that you hope that they'll take from this podcast and that they can apply. I can think of 3 or 4 that I learned along the way here, but I'll give you each a shot at your take-home value. Sydney, why don't we start with you this time?
Sure. So I would just say the take-home value is this is not hard. This is easy, and just start. We have actually made creating these kinds of qualitative data gathering mechanisms really, really easy, both for the people in government who need to sort of, design surveys or design the open-ended questions that they want to ask people, but also for the actual citizens and residents themselves. So we have made it so that it doesn't matter where you are. You don't have to have a laptop connected to Wi-Fi. You could answer on SMS or, smartphone or whatever, wherever you happen to be. So make it easy. It is easy, and just start.
Thanks. Chelsea, your take-home value for our listeners?
Yeah, to build off of Sydney's, I would say that start, but also think about what is the action that you're trying to accomplish when you do that. I think so often we jump into collecting feedback or data with this idea that we want to collect the data. And while that's great, if we don't actually end up taking action on it, that doesn't do us any good as an organization. So, thinking kind of backwards from how are we going to be utilizing this to really drive and transform our business operations and processes, it can be really helpful ensuring that you're collecting data that's useful. And then to the feedback point that we talked about earlier with closing the loop, right? Opening that process up, being transparent about here's the action we're hoping to take, here's what we found out, and here's how we use this to impact our decisions, continues to build upon and engage our customers and throughout the process.
Chelsea Bright is the Global Head of Government at Qualtrics, and Sydney Heimbrock is the Chief Industry Advisor for Government, both of them at Qualtrics, which is a great tool, and we keep pushing the envelope on the ways we can use this to make the world a better place, and very delighted to see people like you who are helping make our government better for all of our citizens. Sydney, Chelsea, thanks for being guests on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We really enjoy working with Walker and appreciate the time.
If anybody would want to continue the dialogue, I did a little research. I see you're both on LinkedIn, and so people that listen to the podcast will have your names and spelling so they can catch you there, I can see. But is there any website or any place they might want to look on the Qualtrics site just for a little more insights into what you guys are doing in the government world?
Yeah, absolutely. We can send over the link to that website address. We do have some government specific pages with information and some of the stories that we've talked about today, as well as, of course, happy to provide our own personal contact information.
Great. Well, we'll make sure that we put that on the link for the podcast when we put it out. And if you want to talk about anything else you've heard on this podcast or previous podcasts, or about how Walker can help your business's customer experience, feel free to email me at podcast@walkerinfo.com. Be sure to check out our website, cxleaderpodcast.com, to subscribe to the show and find all our previous episodes, our podcast series, our contact information. You can drop a note, tell us how we're doing, or maybe even suggest an idea for a future podcast. The CX Leader Podcast is a production of Walker. We're an experience management firm that helps companies accelerate their XM success. You can read more about us at walkerinfo.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.